Jackson Wheeler, a 10-year-old boy with a curious mind, always loved asking questions. However, in Mrs. Randall's classroom, any deviation from her strict rules was seen as a challenge to her authority. This white teacher was known for her demanding style and tough love approach. But what she called discipline, many students saw as cruelty and bias. The lesson started as usual that day, but midway through, something went wrong. Jackson, trying to solve a problem on the board, accidentally mixed up some numbers. When the class quietly giggled, he responded with a smile. "Well, nobody's perfect, not even teachers." That innocent remark turned out to be the last straw for Mrs. Randall. She approached the boy with a cold glare and said sternly, "Mr. Wheeler, do you think this is a circus? If you can't sit still and learn, I'll make sure you learn discipline." She dragged Jackson to the radiator by the window, took out a rope from her desk, and tied his hands to the pipes. The class froze in shock. Some students wanted to intervene, but Mrs. Randall's reputation for being strict silenced them. She defiantly looked at the class and said, "This is a lesson for everyone. Discipline comes first. Don't want to end up like him? Behave accordingly." Sitting on the cold floor by the radiator, Jackson didn't cry, though inside he felt both rage and humiliation. He looked straight at Mrs. Randall with an expression of pride and defiance. His silent resistance became a quiet protest against the injustice. Some students tried to look away, pretending nothing was happening. Others, braver, whispered among themselves. One girl, Lisa, sat closer to the radiator and quietly said, "Hang in there, Jackson. We'll tell someone." He nodded, trying to maintain his composure. Another teacher, walking past the classroom, noticed the strange silence and peeked inside. Seeing the boy tied to the radiator, he was shocked but did nothing. This was a small suburban school where teachers often covered for one another. "Mrs. Randall is an experienced educator. She knows what she's doing," he thought, and walked away. Meanwhile, the bell rang for recess, but Mrs. Randall left Jackson tied for a few more minutes to show everyone the seriousness of her intentions. When she finally untied him, she whispered, "Try breaking the rules again, and this will happen again." However, one of the children, Jamie, managed to secretly take a picture of the incident on his phone. He quickly sent the photo to his mother, a local community activist. The woman immediately called Lauren Harper, Jackson's mother. Upon hearing what had happened, Lauren quickly got ready and headed to the school, mentally preparing for a serious confrontation. Jackson, back at his desk, tried to act as though nothing had happened, but his friends noticed his hands were trembling and his eyes were slightly wet. Despite everything, he didn't allow himself to cry or show weakness. A storm was already brewing on the horizon, but no one at the school yet knew that Jackson's mother was more than just a parent. She was a woman of power, influence, and a mission to put an end to such injustices once and for all. Lauren Harper was not the kind of woman to ignore injustice, especially when it involved her son. As a prominent figure and head of the state's Department of Education, she had spent years fighting for equity and reform in schools. Yet nothing could have prepared her for the moment when she received the photo of her son tied to a radiator. Lauren sat in her office, reviewing policy drafts, when her phone buzzed. It was a text message from Marcia, a friend and local activist. The message contained a grainy photo of Jackson, his small frame bound to a radiator, looking defiant despite the humiliation. Marcia's text read, "This happened to Jackson today. Thought you'd want to know." Lauren's hands trembled as she stared at the image. The anger that surged through her was sharp and immediate, but she forced herself to stay calm. Years of navigating bureaucracies had taught her that composure was her greatest weapon. She closed her laptop, grabbed her car keys, and called the principal's office while driving to the school. Her tone was firm but restrained. "This is Dr. Harper. I need to meet with you immediately regarding a serious incident involving my son. I expect all relevant staff to be present." When Lauren walked into the school building, heads turned. Her presence commanded respect and fear. Clad in a tailored suit and carrying a leather briefcase, she looked every bit the powerful advocate she was. But today, she wasn't just a policymaker. She was a mother seeking justice. The principal, Mr. Edwards, greeted her at the door with a nervous smile. He had been caught off guard by her sudden arrival and was already dreading the conversation. "Dr. Harper, I wasn't aware you were coming today. Is everything all right?" he stammered. Lauren cut him off. "No, Mr. Edwards, everything is not all right. I am here because one of your teachers tied my son to a radiator. I trust you understand the gravity of this situation." Her words echoed through the hallway. Staff members passing by paused, sensing the tension. Mrs. Randall was summoned to the principal's office. She walked in, her usual stern demeanor faltering slightly when she saw Lauren seated across from Mr. Edwards. She had no idea who Lauren was, and assumed this was just another angry parent. Lauren stood as Mrs. Randall entered. Her voice was calm, but icy. "Are you the teacher who tied my son to a radiator?" Mrs. Randall, still oblivious, replied defensively, "Yes, I am. He was disruptive, and I had to take measures to ensure the rest of the class could learn. Discipline is important." Lauren's eyes narrowed, and her voice grew sharper. "Discipline? Is that what you call binding a child to a radiator? Did you think for 1 second about the psychological harm you were causing? Or did you think it was acceptable because he's black?" Mrs. Randall's face turned pale. I don't see color in my classroom," she stammered. "I treat all my students equally." Lauren leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "Do you? Then tell me, Mrs. Randall, have you ever tied a white child to a radiator, or does this so-called discipline only apply to children who look like mine?" The room fell silent. Mrs. Randall tried to maintain her composure but couldn't meet Lauren's eyes. Lauren turned to Mr. Edwards. "This is a violation of basic human dignity, not to mention numerous education policies. You allowed this to happen under your leadership. Now, here's what's going to happen. First, I want a formal apology issued to my son and our family. Second, Mrs. Randall needs to be immediately placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. And third, this school will implement mandatory anti-bias training for all staff." Mr. Edwards fumbled for words. "Dr. Harper, we need time to review this," Lauren interrupted. "Time? My son didn't get time to prepare for being publicly humiliated. Let me be clear, Mr. Edwards. If this is not addressed immediately, I will ensure that the Department of Education and the media know exactly what happened here. Do you really want your school's name dragged into a national conversation about racial bias and child abuse?" Mrs. Randall, now visibly shaken, tried to interject. "I was just doing my job. I never meant to harm him." Lauren stood, her voice cutting through the room. "Your job, Mrs. Randall, is to educate, not to humiliate. If you think otherwise, you have no place in a classroom." The meeting ended with Mr. Edwards agreeing to Lauren's demands. Mrs. Randall was placed on immediate leave, and a public apology was drafted. Lauren left the office, but not before stopping by Jackson's classroom to see him. When Jackson saw his mother, a mix of relief and pride washed over his face. Lauren knelt down to his level, gently holding his hands. "You did nothing wrong, Jackson. What happened to you was unacceptable, but I promise you, it will never happen again." Jackson nodded, his voice steady. "I know, Mom. I wasn't afraid. I knew you'd come." Lauren smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "That's my boy." As they walked out of the school together, Lauren knew this was just the beginning. This wasn't just about Jackson. It was about every child who had ever been mistreated by those meant to protect and guide them. She vowed to turn this incident into a catalyst for change. The story of Jackson's ordeal didn't remain within the confines of the school. By the time Lauren and her son returned home, the local activist, Marcia, had already shared the photo and details with her network. The post quickly gained traction on social media, with hashtags like #JusticeForJackson and #EndRacialBias in Schools trending locally by evening. Lauren, experienced in managing public crises, knew the situation had escalated beyond the school's walls. While she was relieved to see community support, she was also wary of how the attention might affect Jackson. She sat him down after dinner. "Jackson, you might hear people talking about what happened today," she said gently. "Some might even try to make it seem like you did something wrong. But I need you to remember, you did nothing wrong. You stood up for yourself, and I'm proud of you." Jackson nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "I'm not scared, Mom. I want people to know the truth." The next morning, parents and community members gathered outside the school. Many carried signs with messages like, "Our kids deserve better," and "Stop the abuse." Local news reporters had arrived, eager to cover the growing controversy. Inside the school, the staff was in chaos. Mr. Edwards, the principal, had spent the morning fielding calls from concerned parents, reporters, and district officials. He realized the situation was spiraling out of control. Lauren arrived at the school accompanied by Marcia and a small group of activists. She walked past the crowd with the same composed determination she had shown the day before. This time, she wasn't just a mother, she was the voice of a community demanding justice. The school district called an emergency meeting, inviting Lauren, Mr. Edwards, and Mrs. Randall to participate, along with a panel of district officials. The meeting was held in the school auditorium, with community members, teachers, and even some older students in attendance. Lauren began her address with a clear and authoritative tone. "What happened to my son is not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a larger problem, a system that allows implicit bias to dictate how children are treated. Today, it's Jackson. Tomorrow, it could be someone else's child. This ends now." She presented evidence, including the photo of Jackson tied to the radiator and testimony from other students who had witnessed the incident. Lauren also highlighted data showing a pattern of disproportionate discipline against Black students in the school district. When it was Mrs. Randall's turn to speak, she attempted to defend herself. "I never meant to hurt Jackson," she said. "I was trying to maintain order in my classroom." Lauren didn't let her off the hook. "Order? By dehumanizing a child? If you think that's acceptable, you have no place in education. This isn't about order. It's about control and bias." The crowd murmured in agreement. Mrs. Randall's confidence visibly crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. As the crowd began to disperse, a reporter approached Jackson, who stood next to his mother. "Jackson, is there anything you'd like to say?" Jackson hesitated for a moment, then spoke with a confidence beyond his years. "I just want teachers to treat kids like they matter. No one should ever feel like I did, and I'm really proud of my mom for standing up for me." Lauren placed a hand on his shoulder, her eyes brimming with pride. "And I'm proud of you, Jackson." The story gained national attention, becoming a rallying cry for parents and activists advocating for racial equity in education. Lauren used the momentum to launch a statewide initiative focused on combating implicit bias in schools. Jackson became a symbol of resilience and the importance of standing up to injustice, inspiring other children to share their own stories. For Jackson, life gradually returned to normal, though he carried the lessons of that day with him. He understood that his experience, painful as it was, had sparked meaningful change, not just for him, but for countless other children. And for Lauren, the incident solidified her mission: to ensure that no child, regardless of race or background, would ever face such humiliation again. The aftermath of the emergency meeting brought both relief and a new wave of challenges. Lauren Harper's confrontation with the school and the district had set the stage for meaningful change, but she knew the battle wasn't fully won. Public attention was now focused on the incident, and every step forward required careful strategy and persistence. The day after the meeting, Mrs. Randall was officially informed of her termination. The decision came as a blow to her, though she tried to appeal, arguing that her actions had been taken out of context. Her argument failed to gain traction. The photograph of Jackson tied to the radiator, combined with testimony from students and Lauren's pointed questioning during the meeting, left little room for doubt. Facing public backlash, Mrs. Randall gave an exclusive interview to a local news outlet. "I didn't mean to harm anyone," she said, her voice trembling. "I've always been a dedicated teacher. I was just trying to maintain order." The interview only intensified the controversy. Social media erupted with discussions, some defending her as a victim of cancel culture, while others condemned her actions as emblematic of systemic racism. The incident became a national conversation, highlighting disparities in how Black children were disciplined in schools. Meanwhile, the school began implementing the measures Lauren demanded. The first visible change was the mandatory anti-bias training for all staff members. Trainers brought in from civil rights organizations conducted workshops, challenging teachers to confront their implicit biases and recognize the harm caused by discriminatory practices. Additionally, the school initiated an open forum for parents and students to voice their concerns. Jackson, encouraged by his mother, attended one of these sessions. When asked if he wanted to share, he stood up and said, "I just want to feel safe at school. I want my teachers to believe in me, not punish me for being myself." His words resonated deeply with the audience. Parents applauded, and even some teachers nodded in agreement, visibly moved. The school also adopted a new disciplinary policy, emphasizing restorative practices over punitive measures. This shift aimed to address behavioral issues by fostering communication and understanding rather than resorting to harsh punishments. The story remained in the media for weeks. Jackson's courage and Lauren's steadfast advocacy became a symbol of resistance against injustice. National outlets invited Lauren to speak on panels and write op-eds about the importance of equity in education. One particularly memorable moment came during a televised interview where Lauren was asked how she remained so composed throughout the ordeal. She replied, "I didn't have the luxury of losing control. As a mother, I had to show my son that we fight injustice, not with anger, but with action. That's how we create real change." The local community, initially divided over the incident, began to heal through dialogue. Parents who had previously dismissed issues of racial bias started to recognize the need for change. Students, inspired by Jackson's bravery, began to share their own experiences of feeling unseen or unfairly treated in the classroom. The school organized a Unity Day, where students, parents, and teachers worked together on projects promoting inclusion and understanding. Jackson, alongside his classmates, painted a mural on the school wall with the words, "Every child matters." For Jackson, the experience was transformative. Initially, he struggled with feelings of embarrassment and anger, but with his mother's guidance and the support of his community, he began to see himself as more than a victim. He was a catalyst for change. One evening, he asked Lauren, "Do you think what happened to me will really stop this from happening to other kids?" Lauren smiled and said, "I think it's a start. You showed people that it's okay to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. That's how we make things better. For you, for your friends, and for kids everywhere." The incident inspired a larger national conversation about the treatment of marginalized students in schools. Other families came forward with similar stories, and activists began pushing for widespread educational reform. Lauren's initiative gained momentum, supported by organizations advocating for racial and social justice. Jackson's story became a symbol of resilience and hope, featured in articles, documentaries, and even school curriculums discussing equity and justice. Years later, Jackson's school would be unrecognizable from the place where he had been humiliated. The cultural shift was evident. Teachers built stronger relationships with their students, parents felt more involved, and children like Jackson were given the respect and support they deserved. For Lauren, the fight for equity and education remained a lifelong mission. But every time she saw her son smile confidently or heard him speak passionately about justice, she knew that their journey had been worth it. The day Jackson was tied to that radiator could have broken him, Lauren reflected during a keynote speech years later. But instead, it sparked a movement. That's the power of resilience, That's the power of community, and that's the power of love.